Hello, welcome to Gardener's World. I'm going to plant out my first early potatoes. This is a variety called Foremost. Now, first earlies make new potatoes, and the whole point of new potatoes is to harvest them and eat them as early as possible in the summer because they have that sweetness and flavour that no other potato ever can match. But to get them early, you need to plant them early. And normally that's sometime in March. But this year, we've just had so much rain. The ground has been sodden. So I'm going to give it a go here in a raised bed. Raised beds drain much better. And if you haven't got a raised bed, you can do it perfectly well in a bag, a pot, any type of container that's big enough to let the potatoes grow and multiply. So that can go in like that. One of the advantages of growing in a raised bed is you don't have to dig a trench, you don't have to earth them up, you just make a hole and pop them in. I'll get the last row in, rake them over, and then that's it. Now, if the leaves appear and there's cold weather, it's a good idea to cover them up, which effectively is earthing them up. You can do it with a layer of compost or straw or even fleece. Other than that, there's nothing to do. Let them grow and then harvest them, hopefully around about the beginning of July. Now, coming up on today's programme. Sue is at home in her own garden as she makes a start on her new hot border and tackles a range of spring jobs.
So here we are. Welcome to the new area of my garden. It came about because we needed to change the steps to make them safer. And it's resulted in 4 new beds for me to plant.
We explore the Cornish garden of the author Patrick Gale, who has transformed a farmyard.
It is a very lovely place to write. But the funny side of that is, of course, being an obsessive gardener, I've no sooner sat down with a novel than I notice something that needs deadheading.
Toby visits the beautiful Vann Garden in Surrey that has been in the hands of the same family for over a century.
It's incredibly special because I look out the windows, as you say, or I look at the flower beds. My parents' hands are on literally every single plant that there is in this garden.
And I shall be planting up an awkward east-facing bed. This part of Longmeadow is undergoing a revamp. We've put in these stone slabs, which were laid last week. This is the basis for a new seating area. And what I want to do with the planting is to make it as fragrant as possible. And if you're going to have fragrance, you've got to have roses. I've got just one type of rose. It's one that I haven't grown before. It's called Emily Bronte. It's modern. In fact, it's only been around since about 2018, and I've chosen it because it has really good fragrance. And it's an English rose, which means that it has the virtues of long flowering from June right through till the end of the season, which could well be into October. And I'm planting them on each of these points here. So the idea is that there's this sense of encircling fragrance. Oh dear. A brick. I should have known there would be building work underneath here. The truth is that if your garden is on the site where there's been habitation of any kind, you're going to come across the evidence. That's about it. Now, roses ideally are planted quite deep. All roses are grafted, and you don't want to see the graft above the ground. In fact, you should bury it at least an inch below the soil. I'll plant the other 4 roses, and whatever you plant at this time of year, particularly if it's a woody plant like a rose or a tree, give it a good soak. Now, I've got a couple of Philadelphus. Now, Philadelphus is mock orange, and it has these wonderful white flowers that are rich with a fruity fragrance round about the end of May, early June. For most of us, they're a very easy shrub to grow. Philadelphus like sunshine and reasonably good drainage, and certainly they don't like heavy, wet conditions. So let's put that like that. As well as flowering shrubs, I'm also going to be planting a range of plants here. For example, I've got a little tray of Sweet Williams here. Absolutely lovely, really good fragrance. You can buy them at every garden centre and just pop them out either into a border or into a container, and they will grow on and flower this summer and give you instant results. Now, we joined Sue in her own garden in South Wales to see how it's getting on.
It's been a really wet, long winter, and it looks as though it's continuing into spring. But the garden is starting to come alive. I'm removing the heads of the hydrangeas, which have looked absolutely stunning in the winter. I've left them on to protect the new shoots from frost. I need to chop them to just above a new bud where the leaves are coming out. Otherwise I'll lose the flower if I cut it too short. And as I remove the heads, you can see all this beautiful new growth coming, and the plant changes from brown to green in a matter of moments. So I don't want to take too much height off them. But sometimes they overextend into what's growing beneath them, so I may take the lower branches back a bit further. None of this is going to go to waste. Most of it is going to go on the compost heap, but some of it is going to go to make new plants. It might not be the textbook time of year to take hydrangea cuttings, but I don't really want to waste all this lovely material, and I've been successful before. I've got a couple of cuttings here from last year. Now what you've got to look for is a little node to cut to, and you need to cut just below that node. And by doing that, all the hormones are there to help get it to grow roots. I'm going to make a little hole at the edge of the pot and pop the stem in about 2/3 of the way. By putting it at the edge of the pot, it drains more freely in this area, and it gets warmer because in the centre it can be quite damp and cold. I'm going to pop these into a bowl of water and water them from the bottom rather than pour water on the top. And I'm going to place them somewhere out of direct sunlight, and they're going to take about 12 weeks before they root, and then you'll know you're successful when you see new growth. So this is for the long term, but over here I've got things that are ready to flower this year. I've got a new border which I'm very excited about, and so I've grown quite a lot of plants myself, and these are my hollyhocks, which I'm very proud and excited about. I also ordered a lot of bare-rooted plants. It's much cheaper to buy them like that, but they literally come with no soil. So I've potted them up to keep the roots moist and protected. Bare root plants come in all sorts of sizes, and I've got a bigger one over here, which is a lovely apple tree. And I'm going to plant this now. I just want to stop for a moment and share with you my new daffodil border. I wanted lots of different tones of yellow and ones with different heights. At the moment, I've got these beautiful ice follies, pale yellow outer petals, and next to them, they've started flowering a bit early, are Barrett Browning, and they've got a bright orange centre. The yellow on the petals of the flowers complement the lush green growth of the Spirea white gold at this time of year. And I planned it and it's worked and I'm really pleased. And I'm hoping to pull the same thing off in my new hot border, toes crossed. So here we are. Welcome to the new area of my garden, my hot borders. It came about because we needed to change the steps to make them safer. And it's resulted in 4 new beds for me to plant. Now, my husband really likes the colour red, and I don't really know how to use red in the garden. So I went to Hidcote to get some inspiration, and it was great, and it's given me a plan. So I'm going to kick off my shoes and I'm going to get planting. I want more unusual things than just a normal standard flower border. I love to include fruit and veg, and I've chosen a lovely late fruiting variety apple called Ida Red with really red fruits, which is in keeping with my hot border theme. And also this fruit tree is going to sort of mask a slight ugly fence behind me. Sowed these hollyhock seeds last year because they flower in the second year, so this is the year they should flower. They are short-lived perennials, but they grow to over 2 metres, so the flowers should be at eye height, which will be really nice. I'm going to knock them out here because it's easier than doing it when I'm planting. And look at that lovely root system. There's a lot of stones in here, so I think I'm going to call that very well drained. In this area, I've started playing with the pots, laying them out. And I've already planted this bare root rose. It's Rose Etoile de Holland, a red rose with double blooms, and it's going to cheer up this slightly grey wall. Now I'm going to put in my Pennisetum redhead. It's going to grow to about 1 metre high and can spread to about 1 metre wide, so I'm worried it may be a bit thuggy, but I'm going to give it a go. It came bare rooted. I just popped it in the pot to keep it moist, and you can see it hasn't really got going in the pot, which is a good thing. So I'm going to pop it in. They're going to take a couple of years to get to their full size, so I'll have lots of gaps. So I'm going to interplant with hardy annuals later on. But there's one seed that I really need to get in now, and that's a broad bean. So I'm going to make a hole for the few beans that I want to put in this particular spot. They are a heritage variety called Crimson, and they have beautiful crimson flowers which will go with my hot theme. This may be a garden for my beloved, but it's got to have a bit of me in it, and that means fruit and vegetables. So hopefully by summer I should have a feast for the eye and a feast for the plate.
We shall, of course, be returning to see how Sue's garden gets on, and I, for one, am fascinated to see how that combination of broad beans and grasses fares. Now, here in the cottage garden, we've made big changes over winter. We've taken out hedges and trees, and we've planted a lot more things, many more roses, some more topiary, and lots more tulips. And the colours I chose were variations of pink, apricot, and peach. But some have worked, but some not so much. For example, we've got a whole raft of tulips here, which are sold as apricot, but have turned out a sort of distinctly lurid shade of lipstick pink. But I have to say in their defence, they do make a lovely cut flower. Win some, lose some. We're now off to visit one of your gardens, and this one is in London.
Hi Gardener's World, my name's Natasha. Welcome to my garden. We live in southwest London and we have a garden that's approximately 2.5 metres wide by 8 metres long. We moved in about a year and a half ago. This whole edge of the garden was covered in ivy and was completely overgrown, and one of the main constraints when building our garden was budget. We spent approximately £40 on seeds and tubers and another 30 on compost, and we created all of this, just that. It was very important to me to have lots of fruits and vegetables in the garden. I wanted to create something that was mostly edible, but also with some bits of interest, both for the pollinators and for us to look at. So here we've got a mixture of, we've got some lovely tomatoes, some cosmos, some strawberries down here, as well as some basil, lovely chives, and dahlias, of which we eat the petals often in salads, mixed in with this enormous courgette, which almost feels like a tropical plant, and it also tastes delicious. Many of the features in our garden are reused or recycled from our recent home renovation. We've created a frame for the sweet peas and cucumber to wind through. We've also redone our bathroom, and we had lots of bits of tiles left over, so we created this lovely edging for the borders. Although our garden is quite small, we are very fortunate to live right in front of a nature reserve. We also share a boundary with our neighbours, which is almost completely made out of jasmine, which smells lovely in the spring. We hope you've enjoyed visiting our garden. Thank you for coming. Bye!
I think you're absolutely right, Natasha, to grow things that you like to eat. It's always the best way if you're growing anything edible. Although I have to say, I've yet to try eating dahlia petals, but it sounds like a good idea. It would look lovely. So I'll definitely give that a go now, inspired by you. Now, for our scented area, I can start to plan the annuals that I'm going to grow there, because I do want to maximize scent from every possible type of plant. Now, for me, one of my favorite summer scented flowers are tobacco plants. And Nicotiana sylvestris, which is a really tall one with sort of white dreadlocks hanging down, I think is the prince of all tobacco plants. So I'm definitely going to sow that. There's another Nicotiana I've got here called Fragrant Cloud, which I am going to grow, but I've never grown before. It's going to be a little bit shorter than sylvestris. And then there's night-scented stock, which is one of those plants that is at its best as the evening cools down and it releases this scent to attract pollinators that come out in the evening. Now, night-scented stock grows very well broadcast or sown in drills directly into the soil. And I'll do that after I have prepared the ground and planted all the shrubs and climbers, and then I'll just sprinkle the seed. So that can go to one side, and I'll do that later. And I'll start with sylvestris. Now, Nicotiana seeds are tiny. If I tip them all into my hand, you can see they're really, really small. And you do want to try and sow these as thinly as possible. If you don't, and just broadcast it, you get these clumps of seedlings, which are then really quite tricky to separate and prick out. These need light to germinate. So in theory, it's probably best not to cover them. However, because they're so tiny, when you water them, that can push the seeds to one side and you end up with all the seedlings around the edge. So the first thing is to water initially by soaking the seed tray with the compost in it in a basin so that it absorbs it from the bottom up. And the second thing is I do sprinkle it very thinly with vermiculite. And vermiculite does allow some light through, and it just helps to hold the seeds in place. It is important that they have some warmth to germinate. A windowsill above a radiator is absolutely fine, or even in an unheated porch. But if you've got a greenhouse, and even better, you've got a greenhouse with a heated pad, then they will germinate in about 7 to 14 days. Prick them out as soon as you can handle them, and they should be ready to plant out, certainly after the last frost, whatever that means where you are. They will start to flower around about the end of July into August, and go on flowering until the first frost. Now, last June, we took the road down on the southwest peninsula as far as it would take us. We went to Land's End to visit a garden made from a farmyard.
My name is Patrick Gale, and I'm a novelist and playwright, and we are here at our farm at Land's End, Trevili. It's the last farm in England. It's my husband's ancestral home. They've been here for many generations. It is a very lovely place to write, so it gives me a great excuse to sit outside and enjoy the garden with a manuscript on my lap. But the funny side of that is, of course, being an obsessive gardener, I've no sooner sat down with a novel than I notice something that needs deadheading or some wretched weed that needs pulling up. It is one of the windiest places in England, so it's a challenge to garden in. We have sea on both sides of us, so there can be salt winds, but there are benefits to it. It means we have virtually no frost at all. So the garden is full of Australasian plants, which we can grow out of doors right through the winter. The garden is split up into rooms, partly for practicality, because that limits the wind damage, but also to allow for different atmospheres. So we have this very lush, fairly formal rose garden. We have a container garden. There's a vegetable garden, a shade garden, and then a fairly formal little garden around my writing shed. This is very much a romantic, unexpected garden. It has no straight edges, no symmetry, and crucially, you can't see it all at once. You have to keep following these higgledy-piggledy paths to see what's around the corner, putting in plants in such a way that they look as if they've been there forever. Our soil is little more than a foot deep, so the entire garden is in raised beds for the plants to have enough soil space. It is actually a very practical garden for me because I've inherited a double dose of arthritis from both parents, and so I know my old age is going to be quite a stiff one. And gardening with raised beds is a joy. The soil itself is very free draining. We are lucky though, because we have a working farm and we have a beef herd, so we have a ready supply of poo to add to the compost, which I make obsessively. Arguably the most important plants in this garden are the shelter belt plants, and they were the first things we planted. Different types of Olearia, Elaeagnus, pine tree, buddleia, anything that can withstand the wind and slow the wind down. I met Aidan, I think, about 26 years ago, and I think on our second date, I brought a box of plants from my garden because I found his little patch so depressing. Really, what we have now is a testament to my pester power. So I've, over the years, pestered him to let me have just a little bit more farmyard, and gradually what was farmyard has been encroached upon by flower bed, and we've reached the point where I can't expand any further. This is the deliciously lemon-scented lemon verbena. And for most people, it's grown as a little pot plant. But with us, it lives in the ground and it's become a tree. I regularly use this as a tea. They do say in Chile, where it's a very popular tea, that it gives you strange dreams. But I've never experienced that. We were in Umbria and found a little hill town which was cobbled throughout. And we were so struck by how beautifully the cobbles changed colour in the rain, but also the efficient way they carried the rain down the hill. And so we realised this would be a really good solution for this garden. People claim that roses don't like Cornwall. It's not true at all, but they do need help, and we've done our best here to give the roses shelter and sunlight. But I didn't want a sort of 1950s, very tight design, so I've used the non-rose planting to soften it and to blur the colours. So we have plants like ami and sage, which muddle it all up nicely. We love the old varieties, like William Lobb here, who smell delicious, but often they only flower once. This is a very good example here of a modern rose that improves on an old one. This one, Purple Skyliner, only grows to 6 foot and it flowers all summer long. One of the challenges of growing lots of roses in close confinement like this is they're very prone to getting diseases and viruses. I have a really good technique for overcoming the risk of secondary infection when you're replacing a rose, and that is simply that when you dig out the old rose, line the hole with a cardboard box, plant the new rose in the box, and then you fill the box with compost. By the time the box rots away, your new rose should be strong enough to withstand any virus that's lingering in the soil. So this rose is a particular favourite of mine, Dainty Bess, and I really didn't want to replace her with another big fat Floribunda. I wanted Dainty Bess. So Dainty Bess here is growing very nicely in a cardboard box, and she seems very healthy. A particular favourite of mine here is Souvenir de Dr. Germain, which is a deep purple rose with a fantastic scent, and it also has the incredibly useful quality that it likes a north-facing wall. I do look at friends with very sheltered gardens and with lawns, and I don't envy them a bit, because what we have is unique and special, and I really just love it.
I think Patrick is being very modest about his garden, because those conditions are at least daunting, with the wind howling in and the salt spray, and yet he's made a beautiful garden. Talking about the weather, you may notice that the 2 larger privet balls that I put in here about 3-4 weeks ago have defoliated, and I think that's probably because they had to face the wet and the cold that we've had here for the last month, and so they, in shock, shed their leaves. But there is masses of new growth, and they will be fine. I'm planting some ami here in the writing garden. Ami is one of my favourite plants. It has white umbels of flower. There are 2 types of ami, Ami majus and Ami visnaga. Ami majus has flatter umbels, and Ami visnaga, which is this one I'm planting now, has got a more rounded umbel, and to my mind is more robust and has a longer flowering season, and I tend to grow much more of it because of that. The only really big problem with Ami is that rabbits love it. And with rabbits, and I know they've been bad in lots of places, there's not a lot you can do but just wait until the grass grows well enough so that they eat that. Now, still to come on today's programme. Toby explores an exceptional garden in Surrey that has been gardened by the same family for generations.
For some, the big draw is clever or quirky garden design. For others, it's the history. But what floats my boat are the plants.
And we celebrate the vibrant beauty of one of the stars of the early summer border, the geum.
This area originally was supposed to be 4 raised beds for vegetables, but sadly the vegetables are no more, and it's just been taken over by geums.
These are all agapanthus, and they've been stored in the greenhouse over winter. I pulled them out the other day, so they start the hardening off process. And also in the case of the evergreen ones, you can see there's an awful lot of white on the leaves, and this is because they've been put underneath the staging, so they need to get some sunshine, like we all do, and green up. These are herbaceous ones, which tend to be a bit tougher, but with agapanthus, they flower best if they're slightly constricted, but when they get too constricted, then you do have to divide them, and now is the time to divide them. The problem being is they can be really difficult to get out of the pot. This is a dedicated tool, which is a cross between a palette knife and a sabre. And the idea is that it's flexible, so you can work it around the edge of the pot. See, this is really tight. And then just move it around to free it. Obviously, if you don't have one of these, and most of my life I haven't had one of them, anything that you can get in, I am pushing as hard as I possibly can. Now. Oh, will you look at that? That's the result. Now you can see how root bound that is. Absolutely solid root. Okay, that's that. There are a number of different ways that you can divide this. You could get a sharp spade and chop it in two, like dividing a hosta. You could use a bread knife. I haven't got an old bread knife, but I have got an old saw, and that will do the job. So just get in there, be brave, and just saw through the roots. Right, there we go. What I think I'll do is reduce one down by a bit to fit in that. There we go. Perfect. So I've got crocks in the bottom. I've got a compost mix which I've added extra perlite. I've run out of grit. Anything to improve the drainage. The thing that they absolutely can't stand is sitting in wet soil or compost. Right. What I'll do, this will look radical, but will actually help, is I'm going to cut the bottom off, like that. It won't hurt the roots. And if you have very root-bound plants, just break them lightly, just scratch away at the roots. And what that will do is stimulate new growth from where they've been damaged, and that new growth will grow out rather than round the root ball. Pop that in there like that, and then fill in around it. If you do this every 3, 4 or 5 years, you will keep the performance looking as good as possible, and also generate new sections of plant which you can either use elsewhere or give to family and friends. Now, Toby has been down to Godalming in Surrey to visit a garden with rather a special history.
I love visiting gardens, and they're places where the magic runs deep. Whether they're big, small, public or private, not only are they filled with inspiration, they're packed with ideas that you can use in your own garden at home. For some, the big draw is clever or quirky garden design. For others, it's the history. But what floats my boat are the plants. Flowers, of course, provide blasts of colour. And up close, they sparkle like jewels. Just look at the petals on this magnolia. They look like sequin-studded silk. But it's when plants are grown together that things get really special. This is the Vann Garden, a 5-acre design which sweeps around a 16th century timber-framed house set in the beautiful Surrey countryside. This is a garden with something to admire at every turn, and it's been home to the Carrow family since 1907. The name of a place can sometimes give a clue to the soil and the growing conditions. Vann, sometimes pronounced Venn or even Fen, means bog, and that's thought to relate to an ancient settlement below the Surrey sandhills. It's certainly wet underfoot. And this is the perfect fen bog or Vann plantscape. And the star of the show, these wonderful snake's head fritillaries. And they're my favourite harbinger of spring. Such wiry stems, but still they're tough. And I love the fact they've got this checkerboard pattern on the petals, and also that the flowers are so boxy, as if they've got shoulder pads in the top, like a ill-fitted school uniform. They're easy enough to grow in a garden though, particularly if you have wet ground, because they really thrive in those conditions and are perfectly adapted to it. In fact, at the end of summer, they produce these little clusters of seed, and each kernel has this corky edge to it that makes it look a bit like a miniature coracle. Now that allows it to be blown on the breeze, or if the ground is sitting wet, float to pastures new. For the use of wildflowers in this garden setting, we have a certain Gertrude Jekyll to thank. When William Carrow arrived here with his family, there wasn't much here at all. In fact, this place was just for weekends. Imagine that. But then William met Gertrude Jekyll, and it was her influence and a shared passion that transformed these grounds into a botanical masterpiece. This is a copy of Gertrude Jekyll's original planting list for this garden. The original is at Godalming Museum, but my gosh, it's so fascinating. I mean, look at her handwriting. She could have been a doctor. But there's so many runners and riders here that I've already seen at myosotis, that's forget-me-nots, Lent hellebores, I've seen those. Oh, and there's the fritillaria. Gosh, there's only 50 of them. That's a handful of bulbs. There's a whole lot more than that here now. It's so interesting to see this because it speaks of the intent that Gertrude had. Heavy on the herbaceous, lots of wild plants allowed to do their thing. I wonder what she'd make of it now. I think she'd love it. Gertrude Jekyll is famous for her clever use of colour. I mean, she was an artist, but she also brought together the two rowing camps of garden designers, those that like formality, and the others, the late Victorians, who wanted to kick back, push against industrialisation and felt that gardens should be left to go wild. A great example is this beech hedge. It's a tree that grows in the woodlands hereabout, but clipped up it has a certain element of formality and is in fact, well, like living sculpture. These domes were part of her design, and because clipped beech holds its leaves on its branches from autumn, what a fabulous foxy backdrop for this, well, spring scene. Gertrude Jekyll was inspired by the Impressionist painters, Monet, for example, and she actually planted like she was using a palette knife with distinct colours in bold drifts right across the landscape, and she'd punctuate those with brighter colours like the camellias. These daffodils are a great example. You got the yellows butting up to great drifts of the white, and then stippled through underneath, having their moment in spring, are the wooden enemies. The next generation of Carrows took up residence in the 1960s. Vann's current owner, Emily, has vivid memories of this beautiful place.
I think my real earliest memory is probably underneath the parottia over there, sitting on a blanket, an itchy wool blanket with toys all around me and hearing the birds. I think that's one of them. We were stuck outside, come rain, come shine, under the parottia. I only had one rule when we were growing up, and that was don't run on the flower beds. And that was it. This was never a museum. It was our family home, and that's always been really important.
And that was in the DNA, I guess, of the original design, a place to be lived in and loved. And I guess now, Everything you touch, everything you see, every view out of every window must have great memories.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of really tragic in many ways that I'm now living here. My mother died of COVID right at the start of the pandemic.
Sorry.
And I moved in just for a few months just to try and keep the place safe. And here I am 4 years later, still here. And it's incredibly special because my parents' hands are on literally every single plant that there is in this garden.
Well, I know it must have been incredibly tough for you, but I should imagine she'd be immensely pleased that you now are custodian of this wonderful place. The best garden designs stand the test of time. And on the banks above the water gardens, designed by Gertrude Jekyll, you can see the 3 tenets of her design principles. She was very careful with colour, and she combined plants that had flowers that made each other pop. So she would put anemone blanda, which is blue, with yellow celandine and golden forsythia. Plants that are on the opposite side of the colour wheel. She also repeated plants to make her gardens more coherent and tied together. And she also coined the idea of succession. And before this anemone blanda came into bloom, there were snowdrops. And when the forsythia finishes, cherries and azaleas come into flower, keeping the show on the go. Yeah, it's clever and colourful stuff. This is a plant lover's paradise. And despite the fact that it has such deep historical roots, it has so many lessons for now. And thanks to the love and care of the family, and of course, Gertrude Jekyll's artistic eye, here, now, it is a picture of spring.
You can visit the Vann because it's part of the National Garden Scheme, and I can't stress too much how valuable it is to visit gardens. You will always find something that you can apply to your own garden and that you can learn from. And to find out about the NGS scheme, go to our website. Now this is a quince, but it's not the sort of quince that I've got growing down in the damp garden, which I grow for its fruits. This is Kinemeles, or Japanese quince. This is a variety called nivalis, which is white, and it does produce fruits, which are edible. And it's grown primarily for its flowers. And the blossom is really reliably produced in shade, which makes it incredibly useful. It's one of those plants that is actually happier in shade than it is in full sun, and it will grow in almost any soil. So really tough, really reliable. And we have a wall which faces directly east. Now, east facing is a tricky situation because it's in shade for most of the day. So quince is perfect. The 2 Morello cherries have done fine, and they're a very good option for an east-facing wall. But the truth is they take up quite a lot of wall space for not very many cherries. Now, the quince, I actually want to fan it out like the Morellos, and I want to be in line with this path. Other than that, it's straightforward. Anything that you want to climb, plant a little bit away from the wall. Never plant it right at the base of the wall, because walls suck up moisture. We've got another east-facing wall, and at the base, I found that the herb Sweet Cicely loves it. It grows rampant, so what I plan to do is dig some up and add it in along here. Quinces can be trained. They also make a kind of wall hedge. So you don't train them as such, you just clip them tight to the wall or the fence where you've got them. But either way, you certainly can control their growth. I say east-facing is perfect, which it is. They'll grow perfectly well on a north-facing wall too. Okay, it is now free from all constraints and ready for a bit of training. Now, I have got wires for the cherries, so hopefully this will do. So if I try and put a stick in like that, and that can go to that wire, and I've got a long one for the middle, and another one here that will go across there. Well, that's a start, so that can go like that. I've said it many times before, but it's worth repeating, is that when you tie something up, you should always use a material that's softer than the thing you're tying. So soft twine is invaluable. Now, this is where you have to be ruthless. This has got flowers, is healthy, but I can't really train it to go back. So I'm going to cut it off, even though that means removing some of the blossom, because it will take away growth from the rest of the plant. Now, a plant which probably would do perfectly well here, but is best in some sunshine, is the geum. I love geums. They have an intensity of colour. There's something sort of bright and fresh about them. And we went to Frittenden in Kent to visit the National Collection of Geums.
They add colour and interest to the garden, and they shimmer amongst everything else and just lift the whole look of the garden. I get very excited when I see the first one coming into flower. I am Sue Martin, and I have the National Collection of Geums. I fell in love with geums about 20 years ago, and I've been growing them and adding to the collection ever since. Well, they all started with a mistake. I went to a nursery and bought a lovely little yellow geum, which was called Geum montanum, which is an alpine species. And when I planted it in my Wealden clay, it promptly died. So that was a good start. Later on at a plant fair, I saw a nice orange geum, which was called Princess Juliana. So I put that in, and it did fantastically well, and I loved it. Whenever I go to a plant fair and see a geum which I haven't got, naturally I have to buy it. And anybody who sees me walking around with this geum says, "You haven't bought another one, surely?" I say, "Oh yes, I have." And the flower beds get bigger and the lawn gets smaller. I have now got over 100 growing all around the garden in almost every bed. This is a boggy area, and we have a Rivale type geum which is extremely vigorous, and if you want good ground cover, you can't beat it. This is one of my favourite geums. It's called Hilltop Beacon. As you can see, it gets really tall and stands up above all the other plants. It's a lovely soft orange with different colours within it. I've actually got them growing all around the garden, in sun, in semi-shade, and it does well everywhere. This is Geum Rubin, and I love it because of the colour, the beautiful red. One big advantage of Geum Rubin is that it flowers for weeks on end. It'll start probably at the beginning of May and sometimes goes on right the way through to July. This isn't a very big garden, although it's quite intensively planted. So there are geums everywhere. in amongst all the other plants, and I think it's important to grow them amongst other plants to give them protection and to show them off against other flowers and other colours. When I buy a geum, I divide it into 3 and plant each in a different part of the garden, so I can see if it does better in sun, semi-shade or shade. And this area originally was supposed to be 4 raised beds for vegetables, but sadly the vegetables are no more, and it's just been taken over by geums in my long-term campaign to find enough space. This is another favourite, Turnpike Troubadour, a wonderful name for a little plant, and what I like about it is the way the calyx contrasts with the petals. The nice single flower with the green centre, and it spreads and flowers profusely, as you can see. Totally Tangerine, which is in the middle here, which is a very well-known geum, because it is so reliable and it flowers for months on end. And what I do with these tall varieties, I wait until all the flowers are dead on this, and I cut right down at the very bottom and cut that whole stem off. And then another stem will come up in a few weeks' time, and we'll have more flowers. Propagation needs to be done by division. Geums are extremely promiscuous, so they don't come true from seed. The larger clump-forming cultivars, the best thing to do is to dig up the plant, plunge it in a bucket of water, just pull it apart, and you'll make lots of new ones. Easy as that. So when I'm potting them up, I make a mix with peat-free compost, my own compost. If I've got a bit of composted bark, I will add that, a little bit of horticultural grit, and I make a nice mixture of all that lot. I use seaweed extract and water the plants with that weekly if I remember, and they do fine. Now, one thing you have to be careful of with plants in pots is that they might be infested with vine weevil. And so I treat all the ones I have in pots in the spring after the soil temperature has reached 5 degrees centigrade, or in the autumn, with nematodes. And that seems to work. I've never had a problem with vine weevil in the garden. And a very good point about geums is that slugs and snails don't eat them, they don't touch them, and nor do rabbits apparently. I don't have rabbits, luckily, but a friend who does says they don't touch the geums. So what more could you ask for? I love them so much.
What? You can't have that. No, it's mine. Absolutely not. No. Right. I have to say, I am a huge fan of geums. I love them. And luckily, they love Longmeadow too. What they really like, in my experience, is either heavy or slightly damp soil. Now, going from the sublime to the bit more practical, it is now time to start to sow squashes. Now, the squash family includes pumpkins, squashes, courgettes, cucumbers, gourds, melons. And I've got 3 types here. There's a winter squash, which is a butternut. And butternuts have a yellowy, orangey skin, quite firm texture, very good for roasting. A Turk's turban, which looks fantastic, I think eats quite well. And Crown Prince, which is not one I've grown before, but has very, very good recommendation and apparently stores very well too. So I'm going to grow these 3. I always sow 2 seeds to a pot, in case one doesn't germinate or one grows less well, and put them in on their edge. Cover them over. Now I will put these somewhere warm, and warmth is absolutely essential for the squash family. It needs to be at least 20 degrees, and 25 is not too hot. So if you're going to put them on the windowsill, above a radiator, and certainly on a south or a west facing window so they get the warmth of the sunshine. Water liberally, and keep that warmth going right through their life. They respond more than almost any other plant directly to warmth, water and nutrition. Right, I've got more to sow here, and while I'm doing that, here are your jobs for the weekend. If you've grown spring flowering bulbs in pots, when they finish they should be set aside so they can slowly die back and feed next year's bulb. However, this does lock up a decent container. So it's a good idea to carefully lift them out and put them into a used plastic pot, which is a very good way of recycling it. And then you can wash out the terracotta and use it for a summer display. The most common mistake with houseplants is to overwater them. However, at this time of year, you shouldn't neglect a liquid feed. I recommend a weak solution of liquid seaweed. Give this to each plant once a week for the rest of the growing season, and this will restore full health and vigour after the winter. By this time of year, the old fronds of ferns have become tired and browning, and they're obscuring the new growth. So cut them all back, going right back to the base, but be very careful not to damage the delicate new growth. And then, having cleared them away, you let light and air in so that you can enjoy the fresh display. Well, I've managed to persuade Patty to come out. She takes some persuading because she hates the rain and she hates the cold, and we've had all of those things. So she's been snug away indoors, but she's fine. And of course, we're standing under the most glorious thing in the garden at the moment, which is the blossom of taihaiku, the great white cherry. And one of the features of this particular blossom is it's very temporary. It's very fragile. I've known it last only a couple of days if the weather is bad, and even if the weather is good, it's only about a week or so. But while it's there, it is fantastic. And of course, this is spring. This is the season of blossom. We may have had horrible weather in winter and early spring, but nothing can stop it now. We've got the blossom of the crabapple and the pears and the apples. And one of my favourites of all, the quince blossom, which will appear round about the beginning or even the middle of May. So lots more blossom to come. So let's enjoy spring for all that it can offer us, regardless of the weather. And that's it for today. But we will be back here at Longmeadow at 8 o'clock next Friday. So until then, bye-bye.